My friends, I want to begin today with a memory of a particular New Year's Eve in my late 60s, sitting alone in my living room after a quiet family gathering had ended, doing something I had never done before in quite this deliberate way. I took out an old notebook and began honestly listing everything I had genuinely accomplished and enjoyed over the previous 12 months, expecting, given how busy and full my year had felt, to fill several pages with meaningful entries. What I discovered instead troubled me considerably. The list was thin. Genuinely thin. I had been busy every single day of that year, and yet, examining it honestly, I struggled to identify what I had actually built, healed, or genuinely enjoyed across those 12 months that I had once again allowed to pass so quickly. I want to be honest with you that this exercise unsettled me enough that I repeated it the following year, and the year after that, gradually noticing a pattern I had never allowed myself to see clearly before. Certain things, carried quietly and largely unexamined across many years of my life, were consistently consuming enormous amounts of my time and energy without producing anything I could genuinely point to afterward as meaningful growth, connection, or joy. I was, in effect, spending entire years on autopilot, occupied by patterns that felt urgent and important in the moment but that left almost nothing behind once the year itself had passed. I began, quite deliberately over the following several years, identifying and releasing these particular patterns, one at a time, and I want to share with you today the 7 specific things I identified as the greatest thieves of my own remaining years, patterns that, once released, transformed how genuinely full and meaningful my later years began to feel compared to the many decades that had come before. This is not a lesson about frantic productivity or filling every remaining year with more activity and achievement. It is a lesson about honestly recognizing which particular patterns consume our limited remaining time without giving anything genuine back in return, and finding the courage to release them before yet another year quietly slips away in exactly the same manner as the ones that came before it. The first thing, let go of the need to control outcomes that were never actually yours to control. I want to begin with what I have come to believe is the single most exhausting and least productive pattern I carried across most of my adult life, an almost constant, low-grade effort to control outcomes that, upon honest examination, were never genuinely within my power to control in the first place. I spent countless hours across countless years worrying over my adult children's career choices, attempting to influence decisions that were entirely theirs to make, anxiously monitoring my own investments as though sufficient vigilance could somehow guarantee a particular financial outcome, and quietly managing every detail of family gatherings in an effort to ensure everyone present would have a genuinely good time, an outcome that was never fully within my control regardless of how carefully I planned. I recall, quite vividly, an entire summer I spent in my early 60s consumed with anxious effort to influence my son's decision about a job change I privately believed was unwise, offering unsolicited advice repeatedly, researching alternative options on his behalf without being asked, and generally investing an enormous amount of energy into an outcome that, in the end, he decided entirely according to his own judgment regardless of my efforts. Looking back at that summer honestly, I recognize now that I had poured months of genuine energy into an effort that changed nothing about the eventual outcome, energy I could have instead spent on my own pursuits, my own relationships, my own genuine peace of mind. Releasing this particular pattern required me to develop a very specific, honest practice, pausing regularly to ask myself whether a given worry concerned something genuinely within my own power to influence, or something that belonged, in truth, entirely to someone else's judgment and circumstances. Once I began honestly sorting my worries and efforts along this distinction, I discovered an enormous portion of my previous energy had been devoted to matters in the second category entirely, matters where my continued anxious effort changed nothing about the eventual outcome except the quality of my own peace of mind while waiting for it. Releasing this particular pattern did not make me a less caring father or a less prudent investor. It simply redirected an enormous amount of previously wasted energy toward genuine influence over the portions of my life that were actually mine to shape. I found it useful, in the years since, to keep a simple mental image close at hand whenever I noticed the old urge to control an outcome rising in me again. I imagined my own energy as a finite pool of water, and I asked myself honestly whether pouring more of it into this particular worry would actually change the ground it was falling on, or whether it would simply run off uselessly, changing nothing while leaving my own reserves that much lower for whatever genuinely required them elsewhere. This small mental practice, repeated patiently over many months, gradually made the distinction between genuine influence and futile worry considerably easier to recognize in the moment, rather than only in hindsight during my annual reviews. The second thing, let go of resentment towards someone who will never offer the apology you are waiting for. The second thing I identified as a significant thief of my remaining years was a particular resentment I had carried for nearly 30 years toward a former business partner who had, in my clear and honest assessment, wronged me significantly during a difficult professional dispute decades earlier. I had spent countless hours across countless years replaying this old conflict in my mind, quietly waiting for an apology or acknowledgement that, I finally admitted to myself honestly, was never actually going to arrive, given that this particular man had passed away nearly a decade earlier without ever once acknowledging any wrongdoing on his part. I recognized, examining this pattern honestly during one of my annual reviews, that I had continued nursing this particular resentment for years after any realistic possibility of resolution had already expired, essentially waiting indefinitely for a closure that death itself had already made permanently unavailable. This recognition arrived with considerable discomfort, forcing me to acknowledge that I had spent years of genuine mental and emotional energy on a resentment that could never, under any circumstances, receive the resolution I had been unconsciously waiting for all along. Releasing this particular resentment required a deliberate, considered decision to simply stop waiting for an apology that circumstances had already made permanently impossible, choosing instead to release the old grievance entirely on my own terms, without requiring any acknowledgement or resolution from the other party at all. I found this release considerably easier once I clearly recognized the specific circumstance that had made continued waiting genuinely futile, a recognition that helped me identify several other lingering resentments in my life carrying the same quiet futility. Resentments toward people who had either passed away or would clearly never offer the acknowledgement I had been unconsciously requiring before I would allow myself to move forward. I want to share one particular insight that helped me finally release this resentment after so many years of quietly carrying it. I asked myself, honestly, what specifically I believed an apology from this man would have actually given me, had it somehow still been possible to receive one. Sitting with this question carefully, I realized the answer was simply permission to finally stop being angry, permission I had been waiting for someone else to grant me rather than recognizing I had always possessed the authority to grant myself. Once I understood that this permission had been mine to give all along, requiring no external acknowledgement whatsoever, the resentment itself began to loosen its grip within a matter of weeks, considerably faster than the preceding 3 decades of quiet, unresolved waiting ever had. The third thing, let go of the fantasy of a fully resolved someday life before genuine enjoyment can begin. The third thing I identified was a persistent fantasy I had carried for decades, an image of some eventual future point when every significant concern in my life would finally be resolved, my finances perfectly secure, my health entirely stable, my family relationships entirely free of any tension, at which point I believed genuine, unguarded enjoyment of my remaining years would finally become possible. Examining this fantasy honestly, I recognized that this fully resolved someday had never actually arrived at any point across my entire adult life, and upon further reflection, I recognized it was never actually going to arrive, since new concerns naturally and continuously replace resolved ones throughout the entirety of any genuine human life. I recalled, with some discomfort, an entire decade of my 40s and 50s during which I had genuinely postponed several meaningful pursuits, a planned trip, a hobby I had wanted to explore, deeper engagement with several friendships, all deferred until this fully resolved someday finally arrived. Looking back honestly, I recognized that this particular someday had simply never come, replaced instead by an unbroken continuity of ordinary, everyday concerns that had persisted throughout every single year of my adult life without ever once fully resolving themselves completely. Releasing this particular fantasy required me to accept a genuinely uncomfortable truth, that meaningful enjoyment of my remaining years would need to occur alongside ongoing, unresolved concerns, rather than only after these concerns had been fully and permanently addressed. Once I accepted this truth honestly, I began deliberately pursuing several long-postponed activities immediately, despite the presence of ongoing financial worries, health concerns, and family tensions that had not yet been fully resolved and likely never fully would be. This shift alone accounted for a considerable portion of the increased richness I experienced in my later years compared to the many decades I had spent waiting for a fully resolved someday that had, in truth, never been coming at all. I found it helpful to reframe this particular fantasy once I finally recognized it clearly for what it was. Rather than continuing to wait for a mythical someday when every concern would finally be resolved, I began asking myself instead what genuine enjoyment might look like specifically alongside my current, unresolved concerns, rather than only after they had disappeared entirely. This small reframing, simple as it sounds, opened up an enormous amount of genuine living that the old fantasy had kept permanently just out of reach, precisely because it had always required a condition that no honest examination of an actual human life could ever expect to fully satisfy. The fourth thing, let go of measuring your own life's timeline against everyone else's. The fourth thing I identified as a significant thief of my remaining years was a persistent habit of measuring my own life's progress and timeline against the progress of siblings, old friends, and colleagues, a comparison that had quietly shaped a considerable portion of my emotional experience across many decades without my ever fully examining its actual cost. I recalled entire years of my 40s spent privately anxious about my own career progress compared to a college friend's more rapid advancement, and entire years of my 60s spent quietly measuring my own health and vitality against friends who appeared, by whatever metric I happened to be applying that particular week, to be aging somewhat more gracefully than I felt I was. Examining this pattern honestly during my annual reviews, I recognized that this constant comparative measurement had never once produced any genuine improvement in my own actual circumstances. It had simply produced years of unnecessary anxiety and quiet dissatisfaction running parallel to whatever genuine progress or contentment I might otherwise have experienced during those same years, had I not been simultaneously measuring my own life against an ever-shifting external yardstick that changed constantly depending on whichever comparison happened to occur to me on a given day. Releasing this particular pattern required considerable, ongoing practice, gently redirecting my attention back to my own actual circumstances and genuine satisfactions whenever I noticed a comparative thought beginning to form. I found this practice considerably easier once I recognized clearly how much of my previous comparative anxiety had been based on incomplete, surface-level information about other people's lives, information that rarely if ever captured the genuine complexity and private struggles hidden behind whatever visible marker of success or vitality had originally triggered my comparison in the first place. I recall a particular conversation that helped crystallize this understanding for me considerably more clearly than any abstract reasoning ever had. The same college friend whose more rapid career advancement I had quietly envied for years eventually confided in me, decades later, that he had spent much of that same period privately envying the closeness of my own family relationships, believing his demanding career had cost him precisely the kind of connection with his own children that I had always simply taken for granted. Learning this, so many years after I had spent considerable energy on a comparison built entirely on incomplete information, taught me something I have never forgotten. Every comparison I have ever made was built on a similarly incomplete picture, and releasing the habit entirely, rather than attempting to gather ever more complete information before comparing, became the only genuinely reliable way to escape its quiet, persistent pull. The fifth thing, let go of the need to be fully understood by every single person in your life. The fifth thing I identified was a persistent need, carried across most of my adult life, to be fully and completely understood by every single person I encountered, a need that led me to spend considerable energy explaining, justifying, and clarifying my choices to people whose understanding, upon honest examination, mattered considerably less to my genuine well-being than I had spent decades assuming. It did. I recalled numerous lengthy conversations across many years spent attempting to help a particular distant cousin genuinely understand and approve of choices I had made regarding my own career, conversations that consumed considerable time and energy without ever actually producing the understanding I had been seeking. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that a considerable portion of my energy across many years had been devoted to earning the understanding of people whose actual, ongoing presence and influence in my daily life was genuinely quite minimal. Energy that could have instead been directed toward the small handful of relationships where mutual understanding actually mattered significantly to my genuine daily well-being and happiness. Releasing this particular need required me to develop a considerably more selective approach toward whose understanding I genuinely needed to pursue, reserving this effort almost entirely for my spouse, my children, and a small handful of close friends, while releasing the need for understanding from more distant relatives, acquaintances, and casual social connections whose ongoing opinion of me, I finally recognized honestly, had very little genuine bearing on the actual quality of my daily life. This release alone freed a considerable amount of energy that I had previously spent, largely without recognizing it, attempting to earn understanding from people whose understanding, in truth, mattered considerably less than I had spent decades believing it did. I found it useful to draw a simple, honest circle around the handful of relationships where mutual understanding genuinely mattered to my daily well-being, and to consciously release the expectation of understanding from anyone falling outside that circle, however close a family connection or long a shared history they might otherwise carry. This exercise, simple as it was, revealed just how small this genuinely essential circle actually was compared to the far wider circle of people whose understanding I had spent decades unconsciously trying to earn, energy that I could now redirect entirely toward the considerably smaller number of relationships where it genuinely made a meaningful difference. The sixth thing, let go of tolerating people who consistently diminish your sense of your own worth. The sixth thing I identified was a pattern of continuing to tolerate, without any meaningful boundary or limit, relationships with several people in my life who consistently diminished my own sense of worth through habitual criticism, dismissiveness, or subtle condescension, a pattern I had maintained for years out of a vague sense of obligation or a hope that continued patience would eventually produce a change in how these particular people treated me. I recalled years of continued, largely unlimited availability to a particular relative whose habitual criticism of my choices left me feeling diminished after nearly every single interaction, availability I had continued to offer purely out of long habit and family obligation rather than any genuine ongoing benefit to the relationship itself. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that years of continued tolerance had produced no meaningful improvement in how this particular relative treated me, while consuming considerable emotional energy and genuine peace of mind that I might otherwise have directed toward relationships that actually nourished rather than diminished my sense of my own worth. This recognition arrived with considerable discomfort, forcing me to acknowledge that my own continued, largely unexamined tolerance had likely enabled a pattern that a clearer, earlier limit might have addressed considerably sooner. Releasing this particular pattern required deliberately reducing the frequency and depth of my engagement with this specific relationship, without necessarily severing it entirely, while simultaneously investing considerably more of my available time and energy into relationships that genuinely nourished rather than diminished my sense of worth. This shift alone accounted for a considerable improvement in my overall daily peace of mind, freeing energy that years of continued tolerance toward a diminishing relationship had previously been quietly consuming without any genuine benefit in return. I want to be honest that reducing my engagement with this particular relative initially produced some genuine family tension, as she noticed and questioned the change in how frequently I made myself available to her. I found it helpful to respond to these questions honestly but briefly, simply noting that I needed to protect more of my time and energy for my own well-being, without launching into a lengthy justification or defense of this decision. Over time, this reduced availability, maintained consistently rather than reversed under pressure, gradually recalibrated the relationship into something considerably less frequent but, when it did occur, noticeably more respectful than the unlimited, largely one-sided availability I had offered for so many years beforehand. The seventh thing: let go of postponing genuine joy until every condition feels perfectly right. The seventh and final thing I identified as a significant thief of my remaining years was a persistent habit of postponing genuine, unguarded joy and pleasure until circumstances felt sufficiently perfect to fully justify and enjoy them, a standard that, upon honest examination, was rarely if ever actually met across my entire adult life. I recalled numerous occasions across many years when I had genuinely enjoyable opportunities available to me, a pleasant trip, a satisfying hobby, a warm gathering with friends, but experienced these opportunities with a persistent, low-grade sense that I should be feeling more worried about some ongoing concern rather than allowing myself full, unguarded enjoyment of the moment actually available to me. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that I had essentially trained myself, across many decades, to treat genuine joy as something requiring justification, available only once every other concern in my life had been sufficiently addressed, a standard that, as I discussed earlier regarding the fantasy of a fully resolved someday, was genuinely never going to be fully met at any single point across my entire life. This meant that genuine, unguarded joy had been, in practice, almost entirely unavailable to me for decades, postponed indefinitely behind a standard of sufficient life resolution that simply never arrived. Releasing this particular pattern required deliberate, ongoing practice, actively noticing moments of genuine pleasure as they arose and consciously choosing to fully inhabit them rather than immediately redirecting my attention back toward whatever ongoing worry happened to be occupying the background of my mind at the time. This practice, though genuinely difficult to sustain consistently at first, gradually restored a capacity for full, unguarded enjoyment that decades of postponing joy behind an impossible standard of perfect circumstances had nearly extinguished entirely. I found a small, practical habit that helped enormously in developing this capacity, pausing deliberately in the middle of any genuinely pleasant moment and simply naming to myself, silently, that this moment was good, right now, regardless of whatever else remained unresolved in my life. This small, repeated practice, simple as it sounds, gradually retrained a mind that had spent decades automatically redirecting attention away from present pleasure toward ongoing background worry, until eventually, full and unguarded enjoyment of good moments became something closer to my natural default rather than the rare, hard-won exception it had been for so much of my earlier life. My friends, I want to be honest with you that releasing these 7 particular patterns did not happen quickly, and I want to be equally honest that I still occasionally catch myself slipping back into one or another of these old habits, particularly during especially stressful periods when the old, familiar patterns feel considerably easier to fall back into than the newer, more deliberate practices I have since developed. Change, at any age, rarely happens through a single decisive moment. It happens, far more often, through repeated, patient practice, noticing an old pattern and choosing, again and again, to respond differently than I had for so many decades before. I think often of that particular New Year's Eve, sitting alone with my notebook, discovering how thin my honest accounting of that year's genuine growth and joy had actually been despite how genuinely busy every single day of it had felt. I have continued this same annual practice in every year since, and I want to tell you honestly that my more recent lists have grown considerably longer and richer than that first, sparse accounting ever was, not because my circumstances themselves changed dramatically, but because I finally identified and began releasing the 7 particular patterns that had been quietly consuming so much of my available time and energy without producing anything genuine in return. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, even one of these 7 patterns quietly consuming your own limited remaining years without producing anything genuine in return, I want you to know that releasing it does not require dramatic, sweeping transformation of your entire life. It can begin, as mine did, with a single honest accounting of how a recent year actually unfolded, followed by a patient, ongoing practice of noticing these particular patterns when they arise and choosing, gently but deliberately, to respond differently. Another year need not pass in quite the same manner as the ones that came before it, provided you are willing to begin this honest examination today, rather than continuing to postpone it towards some fully resolved someday that, as I have already shared with you, is genuinely never going to arrive on its own. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you identify your own particular version of these 7 patterns, and gives you the courage to begin releasing them before yet another year passes largely unexamined. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Release what has been quietly consuming your years without giving anything genuine back in return. And trust that the years still ahead of you can be considerably richer than the ones that have already passed, provided you are willing to begin this release today. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay deliberate, and remember, the years we waste are rarely wasted through any single dramatic mistake, but through the quiet, patient accumulation of patterns we never took the time to properly examine and release. Thank you for watching.